Yo, what the hell is up? Welcome back to Reviews with Jake, where I just got done watching X. X is a new A24 film about a 1979 group of youngsters who are shooting an on-location porno film. The location that they choose to shoot at is owned by a up old family, and bloodshed ensues. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and BS you and pretend like I'm familiar with this director's work. The only thing I recognized in his filmography was the first VHS film. That being said though, the first VHS has quite the tree of directors that have stemmed off of it, with Adam Wingard and David Bruckner included. So he comes from very trustworthy beginnings, and plus the movie looks fun as hell. And with it being an A24 horror film, that's kind of outside the norm. Normally you walk into the theater for one of those, you're ready for your soul to get defiled. Well, let's start the pros right there. I found that this film achieved a nice balance between the horror and the comedy. But let me be clear, this movie is not a comedy. At no point is Ryan Reynolds gonna pop out and make a witty, wisecracking joke. Like, this is definitely a more dark comedy, much more subtle and suggestive. Like, it almost feels like the movie has a sense of humor more than it is a comedy. For instance, the movie has an insane amount of blood and gore. It is really grisly and really well done. Very early on in the film, you see an animal carcass that is completely destroyed and it's just stomach churning. You know right off the back, this is gonna be a tough movie to watch, and there are plenty of points throughout the rest of the film that make you wanna yak. The violence in this film was completely over the top, so well done and creative, outside the box, it never got stale. So you'd think if you're tuning in for a movie so realistically vile as this, you'd never think that you're gonna be smiling or chuckling at any point throughout the course of the runtime, but that is the genius of this movie. It intersperses these little hits of humor here and there. This movie gets so crazy and outrageous, from the over-the-top violence to all the super adult content, sex, drugs, and everything in between. But I feel like this self-aware sense of humor kept everything in check. Like, this movie knew it was bonkers. It knew it was going to shock you, disgust you, appall you. And it's moments like these where I feel like the director turned his chair around and looked directly into the lens. That was nuts, right? You haven't seen anything like this before. That being said, the movie does feel strangely familiar. It feels like a warm blanket tossed over you from the throwbacks of the 70s slasher films. As mentioned before, the movie takes place in the 70s, and a lot of the production value circulating around that does a good job of transporting you to this era. The locations, the wardrobes, the set designs, the overlaying soundtrack, the way they communicate with each other, the 8mm or 16mm film reel cameras that they're using. I'm not sure which one it is, I'm not an expert. But it all just houses this time capsule where it feels like you're actually being transported to the era of movies like Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street. Young, promiscuous people out banging each other all the time, drinking, doing drugs, getting picked off one by one. I mean, that was the horror genre of this era. Leave it to A24 to bring back not only a film that we feel like we've seen before, but a film in a genre that it feels like Hollywood as a consensus has kind of moved on from this kind of movie. They not only bring it back, but they bring it back in a very unique way. I mean, the underlying crux of this film, outside of the T and the A and the B and the G, blood and the gore. But it actually had some real meat behind it. Like, it actually had some deeper themes that I did not expect to explore in a movie like this. Other reviewers are kind of tossing out there what these themes are. Maybe you've already heard, but I'm not going to be the one to kind of throw it out there in case you've somehow managed to avoid it. But it was a total shock to me. I was not expecting to explore ideas like this in this movie. Ideas that made me go, huh, that's an interesting take. I don't know, in a movie as bananas as this movie was, it was very impressive they were somehow able to weave in these real life human emotions and ideas into the fabric of all of this absurdity. And absurd it was. Like, I already kind of hinted at it before, but man, this movie really went for it. This is such a no-holds-bar movie. Like, sometimes you're watching a PG-13 movie and you can tell where things were edited and censored to keep it a PG-13 movie instead of transcending into R. And even sometimes with an R-rated film, you'll still see them fighting with one hand tied behind their back to avoid the wretched, feared X rating that will disrupt the film's distribution and thus not make them as much money. But you feel none of that with this movie. At no point do you feel like, oh, they're not gonna do that or show that, because that just does not happen in movies you watch in movie theaters. This movie did not give a about the rules that you have painted in your head on what's allowed to be seen in a movie. It just does what it wants at all times. That's for the humor, that's for the super adult content, that's for all of the violence. I mean, I've never seen a movie that felt so free to do whatever it wanted to do. It was actually kind of liberating to see. My guess is that if A24 did not have the nutsack to pick up this script, this movie, we would not be watching it today in theaters the way that we are. I mean, it definitely blurs the line of what is kind of acceptable as a national release. But you gotta give it to A24. That's just what they do. They blur these lines. They give you fresh things, new things, things you've never seen before. Another thing they always seem to give us is great direction, and this is no exception. Again, I don't know much about Ty West, but hot damn can he direct a very good-looking, coherent, and well-helmed film. The lighting was immaculate. The color leapt off the screen at some points. Very long, intricate, unbroken camera movements. The sound design really popped like from top to bottom. This was just a really well-made film, which is actually kind of funny because the guy behind the camera in the film, in the story behind the porno, his whole thing is making a porno that's like cinematic or whatever. Smut does not have to look like shit, and many people are going to look at this film and call it smut, but it is not smut, and it certainly does not look like shit. There is certainly smut adjacent content in here, absolutely, but it finds a way to make it fun. It makes it fresh. It does it in a very thought-provoking way. However, some of these outside-the-box elements that they utilize, I personally felt like kind of backfired a little bit, and that leads me to the cons. Let's start with the score. I did mention before that I really liked the soundtrack for the film, where they had overlaying 70s music. I thought that married very well with the production design and the whole 70s vibe it had going. But when it came to the original score, I felt like it got a little too A24-y. I feel like sometimes this distribution label, the films within it, sometimes get a little too experimental with the scores. A lot of the time it doesn't even sound like music, it just sounds like a random assortment of noises, which, you know, maybe Once Upon a Time was clever. It kind of set the audience on edge because they're not used to hearing music like this in a movie. But here we are in 2022 and we've seen and heard so many of these scores in so many movies throughout the years, especially in the past several, that A24 has been thriving. And I don't know, for me personally, I feel like the allure of the strangeness is just kind of worn off. I find it a little annoying and overplayed. There was also a few editing techniques that were utilized throughout the film that I wasn't the biggest fan of. Like at one point during one sequence of the film, they utilized like a split screen, almost like a comic book panel look, that I felt like deviated from the rest of the film stylistically. They also frequently utilized this very strange and odd scene transitioning technique. Like you'd be watching one scene, then all of a sudden you start seeing random cuts, flashes of the next scene. And then all of a sudden for a few seconds in between, it kind of cuts back and forth rapidly between the two scenes until it fully transitions to the next one. I personally did not really like this treatment. It almost felt like maybe in pre-production and shooting, they almost didn't iron out the transition between these two scenes. They didn't get establishing shots or anything to use to make that feel seamless. So they tried to do some real experimental stuff in the editing room, and it just didn't really feel like it worked. I also wasn't the biggest fan of the jump scares throughout the film. There is an overabundance of the standard run-of-the-mill sleight of hand accompanied by a loud noise. And maybe this was by design. A lot of the films of this era that they're playing tribute to are filled with jump scares, so maybe in that sense it does make sense, but I feel like the strengths of this film do not lie in these sort of thrills. For me personally, I feel like this movie should have hung its hat on the up stuff, the real strange and disgusting scenarios that it makes you sit through. That being said, this is coming from a guy who proclaims that he does not like slasher films, so, you know, slasher films had a lot of jump scares, so maybe I'm a little biased, but I'm just saying, wasn't the biggest fan. I'll also add that there was a little nugget at the very end of the film that I wasn't the biggest fan of either. Just this little piece of information that they just kind of chuck out there after the movie is basically concluded. It almost just felt like, oh, by the way, and this. Maybe in the prequel that I guess has already been filmed, maybe this makes a little more sense, gives us a little more context, and makes it feel a little less out of nowhere like it was in this movie. But for now, it just kind of feels like this random unwanted ass slap on my way out the door that just kind of sent me off on a little bit more of a sour note than I would have if I hadn't heard that. Don't get me wrong, it did not ruin the movie by any definition. It was just kind of one of those things that made me go, why? All in all, though, this movie definitely earned the title X. It was an insane time and I had a lot of fun with it. Obviously, it's not for everyone. If you're even questioning it in your head right now if this movie's for you, it probably isn't. But for the sort of mentally flexible, there's a lot of fun to be had with this movie, and I'm excited to see what happens with this franchise that they're allegedly starting. I'm going to give X a B+. But that is just me. What do you guys think? Let me agree or disagree in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe to this channel to stay up to date. New videos coming real soon. Stay safe. Thanks for checking in.